The keynote speech of the Entangled Englishes in Translocal Spaces conference will be given by Professor Alastair Pennycook. Alastair Pennycook is the Professor Emeritus at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Research Professor at the Multilink Centre at the University of Oxford. He is best known for his books, The Cultural Politics of English as an International Language, which is now a Routledge Linguistics classic, Global Englishes and Translocal Flows, Language and Mobility, Unexpected Places, and Post-Humanist Applied Linguistics, all winners of the BAAL Book Prize. His most recent book is Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South. A second edition of Critical Applied Linguistics, A Critical Reintroduction, was published in 2021. So it is an absolute honor to welcome Professor Alastair Pennycook in today's conference. The title of the keynote speech is Entanglements of English. I would now request Professor Alastair Pennycook to present his keynote speech, please.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's such a shame I can't come to Bangladesh. We'd been hoping to do this for at least 2 years, but it's just not been possible. So I'm still in Sydney, which is a nice place to be, but I'd rather be in Dhaka right now. So thank you to, particularly, of course, to Shaila, but also to Shamzad Mortuza for the invitation, and to all that organizing committee, and to ULAB for hosting this, and thank you to our honorable guests for the introductions and the opening talks. They were very useful to think about. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start my talk. Okay, so my talk is entitled Entanglements of English, and that's very much linked, as you can see, to the topic of this conference. And I hope this will make some sense and work for those of you listening. So why entanglements? The part of the idea I realized, in a sense, has been part of my long project for 25 years, which is to understand English very much in its local context. So what does English mean in different places? And it struck me that actually in my 1994 book, The Cultural Politics of English, with which some of you at least will be familiar, I actually used the term worldliness. And in a way, worldliness was an earlier attempt by me to try to get at the same kind of idea I'm going to talk about today, which is entanglements. In some ways, it didn't work quite as well, I think, but it was a similar kind of project, I think. For those of you interested in and who work more in literature, in post-colonial literature, it may interest you that I took the word worldliness from the work of Edward Said, and right back to his 1983 book, The World, the Text and the Critic. And Said was trying to get at this point about how do you understand what he called the worldly circumstances of a text. And he said, on the one hand, we can leave it as as he said, a hermetically sealed cosmos, so that the text or a language or whatever is quite separated from its surrounds. Or we can, and he said, that's obviously a problem if we just have the text floating out there, disconnected from the world. On the other hand, he said, we've also got a problem if we reduce the text to its worldly circumstances. And these are sort of the two extremes of the challenge. How do we get somewhere in the middle where we don't reduce language text simply to being a reflection of the world, but that we give it its worldliness, or as I want to talk about, entanglements. I was interested by this comment by Martin Nakata, Indigenous Australian writer, talking about the fact that if we want to understand language, we've got to embed it in history, of the users, and all the other sort of things that surround language. And he says, if we don't do that, we're just not going to understand we're not going to have any useful theory of language unless we embed it in its place. So that's why I would argue that things like what I call the utopian logics of world Englishes and the lingua franca and the dystopian logics of linguistic imperialism, they don't really get us there. Because on the one hand, I think world Englishes as a framework tends to, and lingua franca, they're not quite hermetically sealed, but they tend to look at language structure rather as if it's existing out there, separated from other things in the world. And linguistic imperialism tends to then simply see language as very much a reflection of global relations, and global relations seen as in a particular way. So neither of those really gets us at the kind of understanding we need of language as it is right in the world, connected to the world, but not dependent on it. And that's the challenge for me. So let me just take you, and I want to look very briefly at a few texts before I move on to look at some other examples of language. And I'm going to use a particular example in a moment. And I'll come back later, in fact, to the Philippines. But this is the first example I wanted to just look at. And again, I've started with this, trying to get a feeling of the place I want to talk about. This is a Catholic school in Lazi in Siquijor, which is in central Visayan part of the Philippines. And on the wall of this is the school. It's just opposite the church, and this old building was built around the end of the 19th century. And what interested me here was I was visiting the school for certain reasons, and I came across this mission statement, vision and mission statement, with its objectives. And you can see it kind of stuck on the slightly molding wall and it's actually handwritten. It's quite nice in its way, but you've got the vision and the mission, the objectives. And then just further along was the new version. And this is shiny and updated. And I'm not going to go into any depth of these texts. I want to just look at them very briefly to give an example of the thing I'm trying to talk about here. But if we look more carefully at, say, the vision, and we can see how that's written, the Catholic institution, basic education, and then God-centered citizens of the country, and so on. And then we get the longer mission statements that go on a bit longer. What's interesting, I think, with the new one is it's been shortened, so you just get the short vision statement, which a lot of us will be very familiar with because many of our educational and other institutions are now doing exactly this kind of 3-word or 3-statement visions and then the longer mission. And so what I was trying to think about here, I mean, you've also got the nice little logo up in the corner, which is, this is a much more recent version than the older one. What struck me about this is you've got in a sense, the 3 big frames, and this is in English, and we need to ask, why is this in English? What's the history that brings this in English? Why is the vision and mission statement of a Catholic school in the middle of the Philippines in English? We've got Catholicism, and of course we need to explore what Catholicism is doing there and why it's so strong. But then we've also got, I think, with the vision and mission statements, very much the move towards neoliberal ways of framing institutions. And what we can see from the old to the new is a change in the way that's happened, in the way that this is sort of the update of the newer neoliberal framing of statements like molding hearts, leading minds, touching lives, of a particular vision of education linked to English, linked to religion, and so on. So that's, and of course it matters that it's on the walls of this school in this particular place opposite the church across the road and so on. I don't want to go into this one more. I just want to give us an example of how we need to see texts as embedded very much in their local physical circumstances, but also then linked to these much bigger circulating discourses of religion, neoliberalism, and so on. I'll give you one more example before I get into the text I want to look at. These are, they're actually called flex boards, big billboards in Kerala, in southern India. And these are actually pictures from a newspaper. Now, what interests me about this, if you look at the newspaper article, I mean, we do get terms that we might want to look at, like jumbos and so on, that are maybe particular to not really particular to Indian English, but they kind of, more particular to India, maybe. And I want to look, I'll look slightly closer at the text on the right here. Now, again, if we looked at this from that attempt to try and describe something like Indian English, we might notice, again, the jumbos, or the term tusker is used here, right, also for elephant. And we get the slightly, possibly quaint use of the tusker top the list in the yesteryear, and so on. But it seems to me that to understand this text, we have to understand temple elephants and the aesthetics of elephants. And this is all about why some elephants are preferred over others. That the tallest elephant isn't necessarily the most beautiful because it's the disproportionate body structure to the size of the legs and the ears, and that the fleshy trunk of the best one is the most appealing. So, and this is a whole kind of way of thinking that's not familiar to some of us from other contexts, right? To understand how elephants are linked to temples in southern India. And that to me is the way to start to understand this text. We've got to understand it as deeply embedded in that cultural context and religious context, aesthetic context, and the animal world of southern India. So it's to try to get to these ideas and to move away from some of the work that goes on trying to pin down something like Indian English and so on, that I'm trying to get at with the idea of entanglements. So let's go back to the Philippines. And I want to look at this sign here, the Achieve Goal English as a Second Language. This is in the back streets of Cebu City in Cebu in the central Philippines. And one reason I look at the Philippines a lot is I usually, when we're not in a pandemic, I spend time in the Philippines. That's linked to quite different work I do with reef preservation work. But so I'm often in, or used to often be in Cebu, and so I have a lot of connections with that part of the Philippines. What interests me about this sign, I mean, we could look at the slightly odd English, Achieve Goal English. I don't know quite what to make of that, Achieve Goal English second language. It's also kind of very striking. It's a very nicely designed sign that sticks out in this back street. But what I actually want to do is look at everything that, in a way, surrounds this sign. Before I do that, let me talk a little bit more about entanglements and assemblages. So the idea of entanglements and assemblages is very much part of what's been termed the new materialism. And I've been looking recently at this book by Anna Tsing called The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she gives a very interesting account, I find, of the ways in which we can understand the idea of entanglements and assemblages. Now, she does the whole book is sort of focused on the matsutake mushrooms, which is the very expensive mushrooms used in Japan, but grown around the world. And there's a big market for these. One of the things she points out, going back to the 1980s, is that when there was the Chernobyl explosion, the effects of the radioactive dust across Europe meant that European mushrooms are no longer available. That opened up other parts of the world to try and find these valuable mushrooms. And she gives these interesting accounts of the forests, the pine forests of Oregon in Northwest United States, and how that drew this new market that became available because of Chernobyl, drew different workers into those forests. They were former veterans, they were Indo-Chinese migrants, they were First Nations people and so on. So people kind of on the lower end of the economy who are going to go and forage in the woods for these particular mushrooms. And what Singh is trying to get at here is how these mushrooms connect this whole, in part, a sort of global network, but also these very local effects, and how we have to understand the fact that, in fact, they grow when you've got pine forests that have been cleared. New pine trees, particular kinds of pine trees, come up because there's less coverage, there's less shade, and these mushrooms grow on these pines and the roots of them. And so Tsing is interested in what she talks about, these assemblages. And these are how things come together in particular ways. And she sees this again, she talks about how do we see these as happenings? So not just all these different things together, but the mushrooms coming in the forest, and then these new people going to look for them, unemployed people from different backgrounds, kind of going through the woods, finding the mushrooms, finding somewhere where they can sell them, and then how they actually end up in places like Japan. So this is part of this idea of assemblages, talks about the ways that different things come together at different times, and we can look often at quite momentary assemblages. And the entanglements is then looking out at the ways in which these assemblages are entangled with much bigger sets of things more broadly. Now, I put this second comment by Tsing here because one of the discussions now is that this idea of the new materialism is sometimes critiqued because it doesn't fit with the old materialism, which is often seen as a Marxist sense of, or neo-Marxist sense of materialism, where materialism is very much tied to political economy. And so the critique of this strong focus on a material world is sometimes seen as eroding earlier forms of politics based around materialism. But Tsing says assemblages drag politics or political economy inside them, and she said, we look at assemblies, we can understand political economy, but the interesting thing is it doesn't, in a sense, pre-assume a particular global order necessarily, but says, we need to understand how this works on a more local level. And then how this juxtaposition of people, things, and life trajectories come together. To give a more educational context from the work of Kelly Toohey and others in Canada, they look at what they call social material assemblages in classrooms, right? And they say the interest is how human bodies, the physical setup of classrooms, or classroom materials, anything from furniture to books to paper to computers and so on. Also then discourses about teaching and learning, what is considered to be knowledge, local district politics, curriculum. How do all these things come together as part of an assemblage at a particular time and place? So I'm just trying to give a sketch of the way that these ideas of assemblages and entanglements are being used in a sort of new way of thinking about the relation between humans and the world. I also want to draw attention here, and I was just rereading part of Karen Barad's book called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And Barad comes from a physics background, and she talks about entanglements, and it reminded me that, yes, this also goes back to things like quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And Barad has a particular interest in the great Danish physicist Niels Bohr, and she points out that part of the original thinking that went on in that big change with quantum mechanics was the idea that the issue isn't of humans watching the physical world, that we are entangled in that world. It isn't humans looking at nature, is that we are part of the natural world, as is the natural world, or we are part of the physical material world. And there's a co-occurrence of things. It's not us watching the world. The observer and the observed are mutually implicated. And we see that in all those developed through Schrödinger and other physicists, trying to understand then what do we do with the fact that you start to realize that it matters that somebody is observing, and that so the observer is part of that world. And this is also another history of that idea of entanglements, that we are part of that world we're looking at. And finally, just in this brief introduction to these ideas, I wanted to draw attention to this idea that Rani Rabdi brings out about English being part of the problem. And Rabdi just says, if we're going to look at English as a global language and its educational implications, we have to remind ourselves that we need to avoid overly optimistic views about English being able to solve our problems, because it's always going to be part of the problem as well. It's always implicated in these same relations. And I think entanglements gives us a sense of that we can't get out of that. English is always going to be part of this problem of the problems of global inequalities and so on. And we certainly can't assume it's a solution. It may, of course, in some ways solve certain problems, but it's always going to be part of the problem at the same time. So that's a brief background to the idea of entanglements, and I didn't want to develop that much further. I've written about that more in some other publications. Let's go back to the sign in Cebu. And as I said, we could focus possibly on the Achieve Goal English and the design of the sign, but I'm trying to take this off somewhere else here and say, okay, let's think about that sign, but let's look at the background. Let's see where this sign is, what's going on in this street. And I got particularly interested in these tangled wires. Of course, that's a nice link to entanglements. Maybe I'm trying to be too clever here, but the tangled wires, I think, are very interesting in a number of ways. And I'm sure that for many of you in Bangladesh, tangled wires are very much part of city streetscapes. They're not much in a place like Sydney, because tangled wires are very much connected to the political economy. And they're also connected to a whole lot of other things. The fact that people, I mean, one reason we have so many tangled wires in these places is linked in part to the power grid, but also to that people just go up and, you know, put a wire and run it down to their local shop. And, you know, we get all these wires because people are taking power out of the power grid. So there's also a sense of resistance and change in the ways that we get these tangled wires. So I started thinking about this, the tangled wires behind this sign. One of the interesting things is that, again, looking at this idea of Philippine English or other types of English, one of the things that happens is that one term that's been commonly named as Philippine English is the idea of brownouts. And it's seen as a Philippine English term for not quite a blackout in the Philippines. And they're quite common. Now, I was looking at this, and it didn't seem to me actually that it was particular to the Philippines. I mean, it seems to go back in the US to the 40s at least, and it's quite commonly used in books. And I'm not quite sure how much status it really does have as a Philippine English term, but I don't want to deny it if people want to claim that. But to me, it seemed that the important thing was really that there are lots of what they call summer brownouts because of the extra weight on the power grid, and because the power grid is kind of unreliable. And it's a hot country, and there's, you know, people have air conditioners, and the more you get of those and fridges and other things that consume power, you'll get power failures and so on. And so the brownout actually seemed to be much more to do with political economy and the sort of state of the economy of particularly the central part of the Philippines. Now, I was also very interested in the idea of a power grid, because Jane Bennett, in her book, Vibrant Matter, and she's also part of that new materialist movement, and she calls herself a vital materialist. And she's interested then in how we understand this relation between objects and people, and how do we see all these things in their interconnected sense. And she actually asked this question, like, how do we understand a power failure? She's actually looking at the United States. She says, what does a power failure mean? I mean, what causes it? And she tries to argue that we need to see the electrical grid as an assemblage. And here she says, it's better understood as a volatile mix of coal, sweat, electromagnetic fields, computer programs, electron streams, profit motives, heat, lifestyles, nuclear fuel, plastic, fantasies of mastery, static, legislation, water, economic theory, wire and wood. And she says all that's coming together when you think about a power grid. And I think the important thing is to see, when we look at those tangled wires, all of that is coming together, and this sign is kind of implicated in that much bigger world of the political economy, the development, the resources that the Philippines has for its power and so on. And this is also, as Amin and Thrift have said quite recently, about the idea of seeing the city in entangled terms. They talk about seeing like a city, and how do we understand these interconnected relationships in a city. And I also wanted to raise this point then about understanding, when we're looking at general political economic issues, that another issue that because the Philippines is seen as part of the outer circle in some terms, and it's able to say, got authentic English. But as Laurenti and Tupas say, what they're really able to do is market cheap and affordable English. That because of the Philippine economy, they can sell their English cheaply, but also make the case that it's kind of good English, or it's locally used and so on. And so the position of the Philippines within that bigger economy means it becomes this seller of cheap English in a way. And I should say too, I mean, I'm going to look just at the Philippines in this section, but there are a lot of kind of interesting connections, it seems to me, to Bangladesh, though I'm not going to make those connections myself. I don't know enough about Bangladesh, but I see a lot of potential connections between different ways in which this operates. So I hope people are able to kind of see their own connections and disconnections with what I'm saying here about English in the Philippines. So this is the first set of connections I want to make between the tangled wires and the political economy that links that sign to part of the world of the Philippines. The next thing we see round the corner from the Achieve Goal English school, there are more English schools. There's the Success Academy. And of course, with the Success Academy as an English school, we immediately see that link between English and assumed success, that we can, if you learn English, you've got success guaranteed. And of course, what's also interesting here, it seems to me, is the connection to the English exams, such as TOEFL and TOEIC. And the exams, as we know, are very particular constructs. And I've been interested in the work that the people like Tim McNamara have done, and the distinctions they make between, say, a test that is fair, that is internally, most of the work people do on tests is making sure that they're fair internally, that they work as a test, that the different items on a test are equitable in a way. The other side of it is justice. And they say, okay, but what are these tests being used for? Why do we have these tests? And language tests have become these great gatekeepers. And they've also become, not just English tests, of course, but within rights to citizenship now, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, language tests operate then as one of the judges that allow you to become a citizen or not. And we also know with things like TOEFL and others that these also have major implications for getting access to tertiary education, and also often within countries as well as internationally. So these tests are major players in the field here, and this is also then part of this much bigger TESOL world, we can call it. Another school just around the corner is the English Factory. Now that one intrigued me. I wasn't quite sure why you'd really want to call your school the English Factory, or even why you'd want to advertise that the teachers, as you can see in the middle there, are also known as manufacturers. So there's this industrial sense of English, that English is being manufactured around the corner by these teachers. What it's also doing is, if you look at the smaller text lower down, it's English is then it's linked to beautiful islands in the Philippines, and linked to call centers and other things. And we'll come back to some of that in a moment. And a final point around some of this is that when we look at some of the advertising, of course, we get this kind of thing, right? The white guy saying hello. And this is part of what has been received major criticism for a number of years now, of the way in which English language teaching is linked to a racialized image of who the native speakers and so on are. And it's interesting that we can kind of assume that this guy is a native speaker, though we've actually seen in other contexts, we saw it in Korea, where they would have similar advertisements, where in fact the people in the pictures were Russian and so on. It just, they happen to be blonde. And if you put a blonde person in a picture, you can sell English, right? So English has become racialized in this way and linked to this particular image of the native speaker, which is often male and so on. And that depends who you're trying to attract. So the role, and my colleague Roz Appleby has written a lot about this, about masculinity and race in English language teaching, and how these three have come together in quite problematic ways. It gives work for white male English language teachers to travel the world and teach, but it causes many other issues around race and language, and it's much harder to make a case that you're a native speaker, though in fact, if you're not white. But we also have to understand that maybe the issue is we've got to get beyond that idea of the native speaker. But this is embedded in this kind of advertising for a school like the English Factory. So that's the second lot of relations I want to see, the entanglements. We've got the tangled wires, then we've got the TESOL industry, native speakers, and its racialization and this problematic notion of the native speaker, which has been widely critiqued in the field, but it takes a lot longer to push those critiques out into the wider world. So who's buying the English here in the Philippines? Well, if you go around another corner, you'll find a lot of Korean stores. And there's quite a sizable Korean community more broadly in the Philippines, but particularly in Cebu. And why? Well, it's a reasonable place to set up businesses. It's cheap. It's a nice place to come. And so quite a lot of what's actually going on here is that sometimes it's just Philippine Korean people setting up schools and businesses, or it's to advertise to those people to come to the Philippines. So quite a lot of the advertising is also aimed at young Korean women to come to the Philippines. You can come for a holiday, it's cheap, and you can get that cheap and authentic English. So this whole context of the Korean presence is quite important here. And of course, it's not a coincidence that this is Korea and the Philippines, right? Two, in a sense, states that strongly tied to the United States, right? So we see this big presence of Korean churches and so on, South Korea, of course, and the political dependencies that link Korea to that bigger picture of what's been called its English fever. And Joseph Park has written a lot about that, as have others, that Korea has taken on this almost obsessive belief in the importance of English, and they send young children overseas to study at quite a young age. All sorts of stuff is going on in Korea, and one place to send their kids has been to the Philippines, because it's cheap and you can seen as relatively safe, not too far away, and you can go to the beach as well and kind of enjoy a nice lifestyle. So there's the interconnectedness then between Korea, whose economy of course is stronger, and the Philippines, but both of their connections to the United States, as certainly in the terms of Philippines as a former colony, and South Korea as a kind of a state very closely linked to the United States. So this is partly what's driving the English language teaching in places like Cebu. There are also other students from, Beatrice Laurenti has been writing about this recently, about students from Saudi Arabia and so on, who are also studying English in places like the Philippines. But this is the third set of connections I want to draw, which is to Korea and the local economy and the English fever that goes on there. The fourth set have to do with what we can call the service economy. Now, as Tinio remarks, because of the position of the Philippines in the global economic order, it requires what she calls a cheap female labor force that has a working knowledge of English. And so we see this across large numbers of domestic workers, aged care workers, then bar girl singers, and English teachers, and we'll come back to that. And as Tinio kind of says, they're the very foundations of the global economic order, which also oppresses them. And Beatrice Laurenti's work on the domestic workers, working particularly in her studies were in the Philippines, in Singapore, but we also see it in Hong Kong and many other places. For Philippine women, and they may be quite well educated, they can still get more money working as a domestic worker in somewhere like Singapore, and they're also able to market their English. So there's a sort of a pecking order of of maids, domestic workers, with the Philippine workers often able to get more money than, say, an Indonesian and more money than a Sri Lankan because of the English. And they actually read now in these advertisements, they kind of advertise themselves online that's what Beatrice calls a script of servitude, these ways they talk about how they are good workers and will work long hours and look after the children and speak English and so on. And because of that use of English in the Philippines, they're often seen as useful, particularly in places like Hong Kong, so that if you've got a domestic worker looking after your children and she speaks English as well, you're giving a double advantage to your kids. So these, and the supermaids comes from some of that discourse that Beatrice Laurenti has been looking at. So because of that economy, this has particular implications for women and the type of work they do. And so we've now seen this growth of, and it was seen as Skype. Now I'm sure it must have moved to Zoom. But with my former student, Misako Tajima, studied this in part of looking at Eikaiwa, which English conversation industry. And that's very big in Japan, and this was typically done locally. So you go to a school in Japan and study English conversation. It wasn't always clear why, it was just an activity, something people did. But again, a bit like Korea, everyone felt, well, they need to know English. Then these companies in both Japan and Korea realized they could do this much more cheaply by outsourcing it to the Philippines. So you get college, almost all women, college graduates doing these Skype classes, and I'm sure it's now Zoom, and they're paid around 50 pesos, it's about $1 for a 25-minute lesson, to teach English online. And as Tajima also pointed out, I mean, we also need to see this within a longer history of a sexualized domain. So on the one hand, you have the male English teacher, the so-called native speaker, who's marketed to, say, Korean women. On the other hand, you have these Philippine women marketed for Japanese and Korean men to go online and chat with. And this we can also see as a longer history of sex tours, bar hostesses, and so on in Korea and Japan, and so on. That we can't separate the idea of English online through Skype or Zoom from the sexualization and the gendered workforce that is produced through that. So that's the fourth set of connections I want to make here between this sign and the world around it. Finally, I want to think a bit about, I've used the term from Nelson Flores about the cocaification of language education. I want to just draw your attention, if you look at the sign on the left, at the top left there, you'll see just behind it is the Coca-Cola sign, right? Which is so ubiquitous, we kind of don't notice it anymore. And then opposite, on the other side of the road, just by the tangled wires, is Angel's hamburger. And you may just be able to see there's the Pepsi sign. So we've got the kind of, the Coca-Cola Pepsi war going on across the street in the back streets of Cebu. But what Flores is really talking about with what he calls the cocaification of language education was the way that particular companies like Coca-Cola start investing in, they start seeing bilingualism and so on as a good thing, but only particular forms of bilingualism. So and so his point is that the certain types of bilingualism, and so we could say in the Philippines, like Tagalog and English, or in Bangladesh, Bangla and English, are seen as good privileged forms of, well, they're not seen as privilege, just kind of that's what bilingualism is. Whereas if you speak in the Philippines, Cebuano and Ilocano, or in Bangladesh, Sylheti and Bangla, they're not really seen as bilingualism, not really valued in a lot of ways. And this is what Flores calls the cocaification of language education. And Reyes, in a different way, links some of this to the racial distinctions that she sees as existing across the Philippines between what she calls mestizo elite. She says it's not the colonial officials anymore that bifurcated the racial state. It's a sense of lighter races and darker races, and this links to what languages are valued, who lives in the cities, who lives rurally. And so there's a whole sort of economy around different languages linked to the racialization of the state. And this takes us to the idea that's been raised by various people of what are called unequal Englishes. And again, Tinio talks about these language stratifications being symptomatic of the stratifications in the Philippines more broadly. And the Philippines has, in a sense, suffered from the kind of economic development given to it by the states, which is very, the United States, which is very unequal and made some people wealthy and kept many very poor. And what's interesting, I think, when you look, and Isabel Martin here, looking at the idea of Philippine English, and she says, well, if we want to think about Philippine English, it's no good just saying, well, it's in the outer circle because it's a former colony of the US. She said we at least have to look at circles within circles. So you've got educated elite Filipinos who have a good command of English, are comfortable with it, and can say, yeah, this is Filipino English. But then you've got an outer circle within the Philippines where people have much less power to actually do anything really with English and just use it for certain purposes, and then an expanding circle for whom it's largely inaccessible. And we can see that in many countries. I mean, I've talked about that in the context of Malaysia, for example, where you can see very much the same sort of thing of an elite who have access to English and different people with some access and others with still very little access to English. And so the point is that these Englishes are unequally divided. And this, as Tupas Salonga says, reaffirms the different forms of inequality between speakers of English. So if you do speak English, those different Englishes still are differently valued. So that would be the fifth level of entanglement that I want to draw. And of course, as you can see, these are all interconnected in a lot of ways too, and they partly depend on political economy and so on. So and we could go on. I mean, we could draw a lot more connections and so on. But the point I'm trying to make here is how a sign such as this is entangled with all these relations, and that we also have to look outside around it and see how it's connected to the other local schools, to the Korean stores around the corner, to the online English classes being taught elsewhere, to the wires, and to the basic way in which the economy divides people, and that English is also part of that division. So that's some of the ways I want to think about English as entangled. Broadly, I've been arguing that it's entangled with social, cultural, economic relations. And that the point I'm trying to make here is that one of the concerns about talking about the new materialism is that it's seen that, in a way, the advantage of the old materialism from a neo-Marxist position is you're very clear kind of what the hierarchy of difference is. The new materialism sometimes looks like having a very flat hierarchy, that things are much less clearly divided. But I think the advantage of thinking this way is not to say, yes, that they're all the same, but to look locally at what is going to matter, what matters now more than something else, and not to decide, for example, that class is necessarily more important than race or gender, or the economy is more than health. We have to look at all those together and then weigh up in the context how these are entangled and how things matter more than others at particular points. This also then gives us ways of thinking about that comment by Rani Rabdi about English being part of the problem, that you can never disentangle it from the ways it's connected to all these other relations. So this takes us into, in a way, an alternative political space for thinking about English. So we understand the relation between English and assemblages. And I'm drawing on the work of Hart and Negri, who are admittedly talking about something a bit different, I think, with their idea of assembly. But I think the idea that we can imagine alternative modes of action and subjectivity defined not by possessions, but by connections, gives us a different way of thinking about how we engage politically. And of course, this means we start to think, yeah, this can't be a question of access or the more English, the better. That's not going to solve difficulties for us. Celebrating local English, of course, it does a bit of work, but it's again, it can't be about that, because we can also see how local Englishes are connected or entangled with other modes of inequality. So we have to focus on the entanglements, the local economies and ecologies, social divisions, and the roles English plays in people's lives. So finally, I was trying to think, how do we also think of these ways forward? I talked about English. I said English can't be unentangled, but it can be disentangled. I'm not quite sure I've got those words. I'm not quite sure that makes sense in a way. But what I'm trying to say is that English can never be not entangled, right? English is always going to be, as with every other language, and everything is entangled, right? So English can't be not entangled, but we can disentangle in terms of changing the ways it is entangled. And I don't think I've expressed that right here, but I couldn't. I tried different things, but I'm trying to say it can't be. It's always entangled, but we can change the ways it's entangled potentially. That can also be seen as an idea of delinking, and I draw the idea of delinking from the decolonial work of Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, who talk about the delinking for the global South. And my point here is in part that English, if we want to think of English as a language of the global South, and so in a sense try to get it away from its sense of part of the global North, we're not going to do it by just saying, okay, we've got Philippine English or Bangladesh or whatever, or celebrating it's a lingua franca, or critiquing its imperial origins. We have to do different kind of work to do that, I think. And I'm arguing that implies what I call materialist and decolonial activism, research, and pedagogy. And I've been putting these three together recently: activism, research, and pedagogy, saying, at least from a critical applied linguistic point of view, they're in a sense our three modes of engagement. That if we want to change the relations between English and the world and ourselves and English, we've got to in part decolonize, think again about what English is, and that decolonizing is a major process, an epistemological process that involves rethinking what English is. I'm interested in the idea of provincializing English, so we don't get rid of English, we can't get rid of English, but we can, in a sense, change the relation. That's in part drawing on the work of Chakrabarty and the idea of provincializing Europe, to provincialize English. And through those things, we can potentially redress the repressive institutionalization of inequality in contemporary life that I think English is connected with. So that's how I see the idea of entanglements of English, giving us a way of thinking about the way English is deeply embedded in all sorts of relations, but not inevitably so. We can work to change those, but if we only continue thinking about English in similar ways, and if we just work with world Englishes or other things that don't really engage with the politics of English, we're missing the point. We've got to do stronger critical work, decolonial work, material work to change the relation between English and the world around it, because I think we do need to keep working towards that. So I'm going to finish on that point. I've lost slight track of time, but we started at another time. So I don't know if we're open to questions or what we do next, but thank you very much to everyone for listening. Thank you.